Good morning. Welcome to episode 34 of the Driller Newscast, a weekly update on the news and stories impacting the water and drilling industry. I'm your host, Brock Yordy. We got a big week. This week in the news, we'll discuss the impact of low water levels to three major rivers from around the world. For our feature, we'll discuss the opening arguments of Sackett versus the EPA. Yes, we're back to Sackett versus the EPA. Why? Because we have Supreme Court justices, along with lawyers, arguing the difference between groundwater and subsurface water and how it is part of the waters of the United States. But before we get into all this great news, let's talk some safety. For this week's safety topic, we're going back to near misses. Just last week, I learned about a young man operating a rig during a bit breakout that ended in him going to the hospital and his colleague very shook up. How did we let this happen? If we look at Bird's Triangle, there are 600 near misses to 30 minor accidents to 10 serious injuries to one catastrophic event that can be a fatality or a manglement. So I want you to think about that. We are an industry that's very complacent when it comes to safety. We work on pieces of equipment that rotate with several thousand pounds of torque. And it crushes and shears and rotates. We have suspended loads. We have plenty of things going on a job site that are considered very dangerous. And if we look at what the rest of the world is doing, from our colleagues in Australia to Canada to Africa, they've taken these situations into consideration and have come up with better workarounds. And I can say that some of the oldest rig manufacturers in the United States once had bit breaking baskets. While I worked for them, they still had the designs. They weren't making them anymore because there was no demand. But we need to consider this. What is a near miss? 600 near misses to 30 minor injuries to 10 significant injuries to one catastrophic or fatal. A near miss is a situation that, if it had changed in either direction, could have been an injury or equipment damage. So I want you to think about all the times that equipment fails or breaks, and we go, whoa, that was fast. I can't believe that just happened. If a good colleague down in Georgia, Ken, he says it's the pucker factor. And I want you to think about what we're puckering. We have to consider these near misses as gifts in situations that our guardian angel looked out for us. What are we going to do with those? We need to report them. We, as an industry and company owners and foremen and leaders and individuals brand new to the industry, when you have that funny feeling, that spidey sense on the back of your neck, this doesn't seem safe, it's not safe. We need to be documenting those near misses. So what are you going to do this week? We're starting out, just got a couple months left. We have deer season coming up. We have holidays. We got the National Groundwater Conference. We got IGSPA. There's so many things going on to look forward to. We can't have these unsafe acts. We can't have these unsafe conditions. We can no longer say this is just a rough and tough industry and I'm going to have to bleed a little bit to get the work done. We got to be smarter about these things. And it starts by documenting near misses. And if that's coming into the shop and putting into the end of the daily report, this is what happened today. That's all it takes. And then it's about spreading that information amongst the teams. And that starts by documenting our near misses and thinking about that 600 unsafe acts to 30 minor injuries to 10 significant injuries with lost time to that one manglement or fatality. So what are you going to do this week? When something doesn't feel right, let's write it down. Maybe it's just a text message to the boss. Maybe it's an email, but we need to start sharing these things. And we got to stop this buffoonery of putting ourselves in danger. Stored energy isn't just electricity. It can be hydraulics. It can be fluid. It can be a suspended load. It can be that bit trying to break out, or does the tooling break before and somebody gets hit in the face? Go out and be safe. I want to talk about 3 major rivers that have been thoroughfares and shipping lanes for centuries. And we'll start. Reuters on August 19th had a story. Europe's worst drought in years has been pushed the mighty river Danube to one of its lowest levels in almost a century, exposing hulks of dozens of explosive-laden German warships sunk during World War II near Serbia's river port town of Provo. The vessels were among hundreds scuttled along the Danube by the Nazi Germany Black Fleet in 1944 as they retreated from advancing Soviet forces. Since the mid-1940s, these ships have impacted waterways and the size of ships that have been able to come up and down the Danube, especially as waters raised and lowered. There's been situations now where they've had to explode ordnance, evacuate 3,000 plus people away from an area so that they can open up this waterway. Next, the Rhine. Western Europe's most important waterway is at a record low, making it too shallow for many ships to pass. A problem for a country that depends on the river for 80% of its water freight. Germany. Millions of tons of commodities are moved through the Rhine, and shipping disruptions are certain to further impact many economies. Germany specifically is already reeling from global supply chain disruptions and record high energy costs stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is insane. Ships that usually take 2,400 metric tons of freight are now taking only 500 tons, so they don't run aground. This is a massive reduction in load. So we've just talked about the Danube and the Rhine. We can see massive flooding in Pakistan, India, China, throughout Europe. Flooding. We talk about, we get these big floods, we must be out of a drought. The Rhine, we believed, was at its lowest levels in 2018, and here we are lower. And now let's talk right back into the United States, the Mississippi. Limited rains across the Midwest and South have dropped the water level on the Mississippi River. It's a major thoroughfare for moving grain. However, levels are too shallow for many barges to navigate effectively. This is from American Farm Bureau Federation. They state that waterborne transportation accounts for about 7% of all U.S. freight movement annually. When we get into agriculture and we break that down even more specifically to grain movements, this share increases. Barge transportation has moved an average of 70 million tons of grain destined for export. That's about 47% of our total. Rail has moved an average of 55 million tons, which is about 37% of our total, and the rest is moved by truck, about 24 million tons, 16% of our total. The industry has responded to the low water levels by reducing draft allowances, no different than what we've seen in the Rhine and the Danube right now. Now, the depth a barge may sink into the water has been reduced to 20 to 27%, which makes it much harder for ours to move the amount of goods that we need to move. Beyond the draft allowances, the industry had to also agree to reduce tow size. It's how many barges that we can pull up or down by 17 to 35%. Again, we've had big floods in Kentucky and in Mississippi and throughout the country. And these extreme weather events, that much water coming in, we're not absorbing it. It's hitting these waterways and it's getting pushed right out. This is what climate change has impacted. And this moves us right into our main story, where we're going to talk about Sackett versus the EPA, specifically Justice Sotomayor and the legal representation for the Sacketts on if subsurface water movement is considered groundwater. For this week's main story, we're going back to Sackett versus the EPA. Why? Because this is getting really damn important for our industry and how groundwater is defined. We have the legal counsel for the Sacketts and the oral arguments with Supreme Court justices having questions and discussions. You need to listen to this entire piece. There is so much going on, from Justice Kavanaugh to Jackson to Sotomayor to Barrett. There are plenty of questions at what's happening here, and they're going way back before Rapunzel's. They're going back to 1977, and how the Army Corps of Engineers defined this, and then how we redefined where we are now today with the waters of the United States. This is a very important topic. And I want to hit on, if you grab the transcript and you go to page 36, starting with Justice Sotomayor and the discussion that starts there. So here it is. Justice Sotomayor. Yes, counsel, I think there has been a misreading, and I obviously could be doing it, but I have read Justice Kennedy's significant nexus test. And as I read his decision, he was of the view that adjacency defined wetlands that were adjacent to navigable waters, and that he was applying the significant nexus test to deal with non-navigable waters that might be waters of the United States. And so I think that there are two issues in case. Justice Alito referenced only one of them, which is whether or not the tributary that runs from the Bay Fen to the Sackett site, whether that is marshland, that constitutes as a water of the United States. That's what the Ninth Circuit saw. But there is also the Sackett site running directly to Priest Lake. Right there, we're talking about subsurface water movement. And it is said, Sackett site running directly to Priest Lake, and that site does run across, below a road, and below some houses. I believe the government's position, and it can speak for itself when it gets up, is that the connection is very direct, that there is subsurface flow, not a groundwater flow, but a subsurface flow of water. Earlier in this argument, the discussion was if there was flow year round, or if June, July, August, it was completely dry and there was no nexus at that point. And if there needed to be a nexus year round, again, we're having a big hydrogeological discussion. Back to Sotomayor. Isn't that, am I correct about the factual nature of this case? This is legal counsel for the Sacketts, Mr. Schiff. Justice Sotomayor, you're correct that the record contains some evidence to the effect that there is subsurface flow from the Fen wetlands that are north of the site, south underneath the Sackett's property. Back to Justice Sotomayor. I'm not going that far. I'm going from the Sackett site to Priest Lake. There is some evidence there's a subsurface flow there. Legal counsel Schiff. That is correct, Justice Sotomayor. Now, as I understand it, there's a difference between groundwater and subsurface flows. Am I correct about that too? Now we're getting into the argument of groundwater versus subsurface flows. Legal counsel Schiff for the Sacketts. I don't believe, Justice Sotomayor, that the EPA has ever made such a distinction. And certainly in the position of someone like the Sacketts, there practically is no distinction, whether it's subsurface or really subsurface. Justice Sotomayor. Well, I think cut off by legal counsel Schiff. One can't see it. Justice Sotomayor. No, it's not that hard. I mean, if you can see it and you can see subsurface water when you put your foot in the sand and you can feel it underneath the top of the sand, you can feel it in how watery your soil is. I mean, it's not impossible to know that there's a subsurface. You could put a stake or a plot or something into it and feel it immediately, or have it spring up immediately. So there is a difference between groundwater and subsurface water, isn't there? Legal counsel Schiff. Justice Sotomayor, I don't believe legally there is really any distinction. Again, if the relevant point is, can one distinguish anything on the Sackett's property from Priest Lake, whether it's subsurface or substantial? Justice Sotomayor. But you don't think there's a difference? Legal counsel Schiff. Well, one thing, Justice Sotomayor, that I think is problematic with relying upon any sort of subsurface connection is that it essentially renders the test limitless. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Justice Sotomayor. Why? Legal counsel Schiff. It's hard to imagine any property in the country that does not have some degree of subsurface flow at whatever depth that will ultimately, I mean, the hydrological cycle is unified. Ultimately, that water is going to flow to some surface water. It's hard to imagine that Congress could have intended, especially in a statute that imposes such significant penalties for someone who guesses wrong as to whether or not his or her property is regulated. Justice Sotomayor. Well, that goes back to Justice Jackson's point. That's what Congress was concerned about, was ensuring the sanctity of our waters and that those things that directly discharged into them would be safe, to keep our waters safe. This entire discussion has gone back and forth from, does the nexus have to be connected year round? Or if June, July, and August, it's too dry, it's no longer connected. And there's multiple pieces to this that come right back to the waters of the United States. And this discussion is very important. Just like Jesse Richardson talked about, we need our associations, state, National Groundwater Association, the Water System Council. You know, these are discussions we need to be having, and we need to understand that by December, when we're all together for IGSBA and National Groundwater Association, there's going to be some other big pieces that have come out. And the final piece to this, after they go back and forth some more, Justice Sotomayor comes back and says, that's assuming it's subsurface water is not differentiated between groundwater. Legal counsel Schiff. Justice Sotomayor, again, I don't think there is certainly a legal distinction that the EPA has ever articulated between the two. And moreover, I think as a practical matter to the property owner, if it's subsurface, it doesn't necessarily flow that one standing in a marsh. The Sackett's property certainly wasn't a marsh. We have lawyers and Supreme Court justices discussing the hydrogeological cycle in groundwater. This is very important for us to be paying attention to. This is no different than earlier this year when I said, get on, watch the Waters of the United States roundtables and see how the home building associations versus property owners versus the ag industry versus city municipalities and wastewater are all talking about the problems and what's happening and what can impact and how we protect our watersheds and the waters of the United States. And ultimately, because groundwater is going to be in play, and we better be advocating and educating, or we're going to find ourselves in a very precarious situation. Go listen to these oral arguments. We haven't even gotten into the EPA's discussion yet. Thanks for joining us for episode 34 of the Driller Newscast. There's a lot going on in our industry. It's very important for us to be thinking about how climate change and extreme weather is impacting our industries. Billions of dollars of impacting businesses and residents and supply chain throughout the world. And then why are we still hammering on Sackett versus the EPA and the waters of the United States, and the importance of listening to all of this, because we need to hear it firsthand. We can't have this odd op-ed piece that we pick up somewhere. We need to understand what's going on and how important it is in defining groundwater and having those discussions at our state associations and the National Groundwater. Jesse Richardson is an awesome industry professional for sharing the information he's sharing with us. And the same as you get a chance to listen to Tom Hanna or any of those gurus out there, listen about groundwater and the importance of our water infrastructure and how it's going to continue to be impacting our industry. We need to be recording near misses. We need to understand that when something feels unsafe, we shouldn't be doing it. We should be finding a better way. Go out, have a safe and productive week.